I don't remember much. And more goes each day. There are faces I recognize without knowing their name. They smile like they know me, so I smile back. I used to have stories. I know I love someone. I know I work hard. I know I come from somewhere far away. I'm glad someone asked me who I was when I still knew. They saved my voice and kept my story when I no longer could. So even if I don't remember where I come from, they will. Even if I look at them and don't know their names, they still know mine.
Welcome to the Vietnamese podcast. I have John back on, our professor from Columbia, and we are back with an AMA to talk about the last episode on Quốc Ngữ. Welcome back, John.
Hey, how's it going, Kenneth? It's been a minute. Good to see you.
It's been a minute. Yeah, it's blink of an eye and months go by.
Yeah, it's true, especially this spring. It's been busy, but it's good to sit down with you again after so long.
So we are going to get into the comment section on our last episode on Quốc Ngữ, and we have a few things that we can talk about that reflect back on the comments. Some people brought in really interesting topics.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. Thank you to everybody who engaged in the conversation. You know, we were a little spicy with our title, I think, trying to bring people in. But it was gratifying to see that some of you not only clicked on the video, but you watched the video or you listened to the whole conversation and you had some intelligent and thought-provoking questions to ask. So that was nice. So don't fall just for the clickbait. There's something behind the clickbait as well. So thanks for staying for the episode.
You know, one of the first questions is this idea of literacy and how we can kind of clock it and how we can understand what the literacy rates were back then. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, that was a really good point that was raised in the Q&A or the comments thread. The question about specifically the literacy rate of the Lê Dynasty under Lê Thánh Tông, and there was a little bit of a back and forth between some commenters, which was great. The question was, how do we understand the literacy of that time? Because in the context of the episode, we were talking about Quốc Ngữ and, the jump in literacy and how important that was later in the 19th and 20th centuries. We're really the 20th century. And how does that compare with literacy, say, going way back to the 15th century? So the first thing I want to note about the 15th century, which is the Lê Dynasty, especially under Lê Thánh Tông, the sort of most famous emperor who is celebrated for his educational reforms. He was a staunch Neo-Confucian. He implemented rigorous civil service examinations, and he also endorsed poetry very famously. So the first thing I want to note is that when we talk about literacy in that time, we are not really talking about literacy in chữ nôm, and that means not literacy in the Vietnamese language. We're really talking about literacy in literary Chinese or literary Sinitic, văn ngôn as we call it in Vietnamese. So you can go back to a previous episode where we talked about the legacy of literary Sinitic as a part of Vietnamese culture, part of Vietnamese history. Very, very true for the 15th century. You can almost think of this as the zenith of that kind of educational system. We don't have any idea of what literacy was like in Nome. We do know that Nguyen Chai had lived his life by this point, famous poet, and had written a body of poetry in Nome, which survives to this day. We also know that Lê Thánh Tông, well, at least according to tradition, commissioned a kind of poetic group that also composed a body of poetry in Nome. So there was some Nome literacy. Nome existed at this time. But what I'm about to say is not statistics for Nome literacy or Vietnamese literacy, but statistics in literary Chinese. And once again, when we talk about literacy in general, the default is literary Sinitic. It's not literacy in Vietnamese Nome. So with that said, it's hard to know, of course, what the literacy rates are so long ago, because there is no such thing as a census for literacy at that time. We have estimates about the population. I'm not an expert here, and I didn't take the time to look up verifiable numbers, but I think this is purely impressionistic, but I think it's something like 4 million. It's in the millions, low millions for the entire kingdom. But I'd have to look that up again. But one of the main ways we can sort of try to detect what the literacy level is by looking at the civil service exam, because we do have pretty good numbers and records for who took that exam. So if you remember, if you listen to our previous episodes, the civil service exam, is very famous in East Asia, is an exam that was implemented across the kingdom or across the empire, if you're in China, to select men to serve in the government. And it was an exam based on essentially on the classics, but also on poetic composition. So there was a civil exam, and then there's a bunch of exams for the professions like law, astronomy, and things like that, military exam as well. So of course, the first question you should ask yourself is, in what language did you take that exam? And the answer you should all know already is you took that exam in literary Sinitic, right? It was not an exam administered in Vietnamese. Nome. So if we have numbers about people who took and passed that exam, then we can sort of kind of extract an impression of how many people were able to read and write, because it's a written exam, of course. The numbers I'm about to give you I rely on my teacher, Keith Taylor, who wrote an excellent history of Vietnam called The History of the Vietnamese, which is available, at anywhere you can buy books. I highly recommend it. It's a very rich book, and it relies heavily on Đại Việt Sử Ký Toàn Thư, which is the main chronicle of the Lê Dynasty, the main historical chronicle. So in Lê Thánh Tông time, he implemented a triennial exam starting in 1463, which means they did exams every 3 years. But there was different levels to the exam. So there was a kind of provincial level. There was also probably a lowest level, like a village level. And then you go to the provincial level, and then you go to the metropolitan level, and then you go to there is another level, the highest level. And in 1463, there were 4,400 regional or provincial graduates. And in 1514, there were 5,700. And that means that there's about 4,000 men graduating from regional exams every 3 years that go on to the capital exams. And that suggests, in turn, 5 applicants from every district in the kingdom. So every district, that means all across the entire kingdom of Đại Việt, not just the area around Hanoi. And then of all of those, so that suggests pretty high. When we say district, we mean huyện, if you know what a huyện is. So 5 people from every huyện are literate enough to apply for the exam. And you got to think that that's a pretty high bar of literacy, because it's the exam on the classics and on poetry. So if you think about it that way, then there must have been a much higher level of people who just could read or write, to write the menu on their restaurant, or to write a receipt, or to write in a diary, or to write a letter. That type of literacy is lower bar of literacy. So if we've got 5 people, sorry, go ahead.
But John, how do we extrapolate that's a high number from a huyện? And how many people were in a huyện, right? I mean,
yeah,
was
that's a good
200?
question.
Yeah, 2,000.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So it is, if you look at the estimates of the overall population of the country, it's very low. For a country, for a kingdom of this time, it's very high, because literacy is low. Literacy is an elite practice at this time. But that was exactly the point I wanted to make, was that if you're talking about a kingdom of 4 million people, that's not very high. It's in the low, single digits, I think, percentage wise, for that high level of literacy. And it gets really tricky though, because then how many people could read in that more casual way that I just described? And it gets even trickier as per that person's question, because in that lower kind of more casual literacy, how many people don't know literary Sinitic, but maybe know enough Nome to write a letter to their mom, And so that's just, we have no idea.
Yeah. There's also another question that I have too that's related, is that why did they limit it to just 5 per win? What if they could have had 20 take the test per win, right? And that would maybe reflect a bigger proportion.
Yeah. Well, it's not limited. So it's not that there was a law that said only 5 per win.
Oh, okay.
What it means is that according to these statistics, which again, I'm borrowing from Professor Taylor, so I haven't done an in-depth analysis of these numbers. But what Professor Taylor and others have done is have looked at the number of graduates in those years and said, this means there must have been around 5 per district. Right. But the reason why that's striking is because we're talking about per district across the kingdom. You have to remember this is not a modern kingdom, right? So it's not striking if it's 5 people from the districts around Hanoi, because that's the metropolitan area. But we're talking about across every district, going all the way down to Thanh Hóa, and all the way west, all the way north. So this is widespread. The idea of these numbers is that the preparation and literacy training for the exams is widespread across the entire kingdom. And it is a pretty low number when you look at overall numbers. And I don't know the numbers for, contemporary France, for example, which is probably would be a good kind of counterexample, or like a good comparison to make. But of course, in general, you want to remember that literacy is very, very low compared to modern times in this moment. What we talked about last time is that there is nevertheless a culture of literacy in Dai Viet that is tied to the civil service exam, and these numbers demonstrate that despite the fact that we have no, mass printing yet, we do have printing, but we don't have a mass industrialized printing. This is a striking level of literacy. And also, again, remember that those numbers are low because that's just from the civil service exam. So many more people must have been able to read, and more people must have been able to read at various levels than what we're seeing just in these. This is like, the top, essentially, of the educational system. And if the very top of the educational system, is already so robust, that's why we say we have this impression of high literacy, quote unquote, high literacy in the lay. But when you compare that with the 20th century, there is no comparison. So those of you who were like, well, Quốc Ngữ, must have been responsible for a spike in literacy, you're 100% correct. But it has much more to do it has to do with many more things other than the simplicity of the alphabet. Because the main thing that happened is that the printing press was invented in Gutenberg. So we already had printing in East Asia in the form of woodblock printing. But the movable print, there was a kind of movable print in East Asia as well, but that's in the weeds. The European invention of the Gutenberg press stimulated an industry of printing, which made it cheap to print a bunch of literature to disseminate. And that is the main factor in the spike in literacy, in both in Europe and then in Vietnam. So by the time of the 20th century, not only do you have the alphabet, but you have a concept or a precedent of industrialized printing. And when you have industrialized printing, that facilitates widespread education in a way that was not possible before that technology. So that Gutenberg press is really fascinating to think about how knowledge spread. It's a letterpress, which is you put these letters on a board and it just moves and prints on the page. But I wanted to, since we're on that topic, is this a total weird tangent? Because Chinese characters. Did it affect Chinese in that same way? Because I know that the typeface for like individual like Romanic alphabets
are movable. But what about the Chinese characters? Because there's so many Chinese characters. And how does that relate to Vietnamese or Sinitic, literary Sinitic at the time?
Yeah, that's a great question. We touched upon it a little bit in a previous episode, but again, there was actually a kind of movable print in East Asia, invented in East Asia, long before the Gutenberg press. But when you think about it, so when we say movable print, what we mean is that we have a little seal kind of for each letter in the Gutenberg press, and then you can rearrange them to spell any kind of word you want, right? So as to your point, Kenneth, there aren't letters in the Sinitic writing script, right? There are characters. But in the previous version of the East Asian invention of movable print, what you did was you created an individual block for each individual character. So in woodblock printing, the normal kind of printing, the first kind of mass printing that was invented by humans is woodblock printing, and it was probably developed in China at the end of the Tang Dynasty, early Song. Some people argue about this now because there's some indications of West Asia or Middle Eastern sort of movements in that direction, but it's fairly accepted that it's a Chinese invention. And in a woodblock print, you have to carve the entire page of a book. Like you have a big wood block, right? A huge slab of wood, and you carve in reverse page by page of the book you want to print, and then you run in Vietnam it's a kind of paper called zigzag. You run the paper across the whole block, and you printed one page. Actually, you printed two pages, right? Because there's A and B side per time. But what does that mean? It means that you have one set of wood blocks, hundreds of wood blocks for one book, and then you have to carve all over again. If you have another book. So movable print, when it was invented in East Asia, was based on the concept of woodblock printing, but instead of page by page blocks, you carved individual blocks for individual characters that you could then rearrange to compose a page. So that's the basic idea of movable print, and it exists. It was invented in East Asia. The oldest example, I think, someone fact check me on this, of a printed woodblock, a printed movable type book is actually a Korean book that was printed using Korean movable type that was on display in Paris for a little while, but I don't know where it lives forever, probably in Korea somewhere. That said, the Gutenberg printing press was invented completely independently in Europe. Same basic principle, but has a different kind of mechanics to it. Of course, it's developed around the alphabet. But it also it was sort of associated with a kind of a whole movement of mass literacy, because of course the most famous thing that the Gutenberg press printed was the Vulgate Bible. Exactly, the Bible that was not in Hebrew and Greek or even in Latin. Latin is a translation of the original Old and New Testament, right? But it was written in the vulgar languages, German, whatever. So it's a combination of a new technology, which is the printing press, together with a kind of new attention towards literacy or reading at the popular level. And the technology allows for the spread of literacy across the popular level. So there's a whole movement there, and I think I'm not sure, but I think that general levels of elite literacy are higher in places like Vietnam and China than in medieval Europe. But then this combination of factors totally transforms the landscape of literacy in Europe. And we get that in Vietnam with Quốc Ngữ, and with Quốc Ngữ printing in the 20th century. And Quốc Ngữ literacy does just sort of spread like wildfire because the alphabet is easier, because there is now an attention towards popular literacy as a mode of modernization. Many, many intellectuals in colonial Vietnam were like, we need to make the masses literate because that's what's holding us back. And then this technology allowed for Quốc Ngữ magazines to be printed just in the thousands. We have so many literary magazines from the early 20th century that are evidence that literacy was exploding across Vietnam at this time. So when we say there was high literacy in the lay, we mean it, but not in the same proportion. It's a total different game when we get to the 20th century. Yeah.
You know, it's heartbreaking to kind of like meditate and reflect on the idea of populations of people like in the United States and Vietnam or China being literate, or not even maybe literacy as much as being able to ingest a lot of knowledge to make decisions. And I think that when it's a total tangent when I think about the United States today and how many people are actually reading and just deep diving into politics or policy that's happening in the world. It's frightening to think about how little we as a society is doing the reading and the work.
Yeah, you're so good at these interesting tangents. I think it's really fascinating because the condition now and also the dangers are so different than they were back then.
Yeah.
Back then, people were like, our weakness is, well, they have thought two things. One, they thought in the 20th century, our weakness is that the masses are not literate, right? We have to educate the masses in order to progress. And even before then, we can talk about examples where that sentiment is expressed. For example, in Korea in the 15th century, around the same time that Lê Thanh was implementing the exam, the Hangul alphabet is invented in Korea, and the Korean king Sejong writes exactly that in the preface to the book that releases Hangul. He says, literacy is too hard. There's all these people who want to express their ideas and they can't do it because it's too hard. Now I've invented this alphabet where even a stupid person can learn it in like 45 minutes, so it's a little harsh, but he's being kind of compassionate, and there is this sensibility that, some people are suffering because of the block to literacy, and that's so different than today. But at the same time, especially if you go way back in the history of literacy, there's also this other idea, which is literacy is dangerous. For example, you go all the way back to Xingzi, one of the most famous Confucian scholars from the classical period, the classical Chinese history period, Zhou Dynasty, even before the Zhou Dynasty, rather, the classical era. And Xingzi is like, you need a teacher. If you don't have a teacher, you don't have a proper teacher, you're going to kind of become a poisoned mind. You're going to do more damage than good. It's better that you're ignorant. It's better that you can't read than to not have a teacher. Wow. And in a weird way, like we're in that moment now where like everyone can read, everyone has just limitless information at their fingertips, but so much of it is bad information. Some of it is fake news, our favorite word of the era. And so much of it is good news, but then we don't have the intellectual training to sift it, to make sense of it. Instead, we're kind of compiling our own bubbles of conclusions that are really extremely dangerous, So in a weird way, we are in a moment. I'm not pro-ignorance. I don't think that we should all forget to read, but the challenge is different in this moment. The challenge is how do we become a literate people responsibly? And there's just a lot of irresponsible dissemination of information and processing of that information, in the world in this moment. It's interesting.
Fascinating. You could dedicate a whole episode just to this idea of gatekeeping, literacy, gatekeeping ideas, both in Vietnam and the United States and maybe abroad in Europe.
Yeah. It's a really good question. And that tension between gatekeeping and the dangers of I don't want to put it in, I'm going to get canceled for the dangers of mass literacy. Like, again, I think everyone should be able to read, but there's a danger, right? It's, like in martial arts, like in Giang Ho literature, there's this idea of like a nap lam, like a poison dragon. Like if you learn, like my favorite character of all time from Anh Hùng Xạ Điêu is Mai Siu Phong. She's like the disciple of Wang Lao Ta, the Eastern poison. He's the unorthodox guy. I'm sorry, this is a total rabbit hole. Mai Siu Phong steals the most powerful martial arts manual, Kiu Âm Chân Kinh, if you remember Kiu Âm Chân Kinh. And she steals it from Wang Lao Ta, and she learns it wrong, because she doesn't have the training to learn how to practice that martial art. And she learns it in such a way she becomes super powerful, but she has to kill people. Like she has to like she has this claw martial art where she hits you in the forehead and there's 3 little holes in your head and you die. She has to do that over and over again to maintain her power because she learned the martial art wrong. And in a way, if you look at the history of reading, like literacy is a kind of magical art like that, you know? And, you know, it equips you to learn so much, but you can learn in really very wrong ways, you know? And I think there's something about that that's important for us now when we have so much information at our fingertips and we have a kind of arrogance about processing that information, you know, like we can learn it on our own. We don't need any help. And then you end up with very wrong conclusions sometimes.
So because we've gone down this rabbit hole, we have to keep it going just for a little bit longer because I can't stop it.
I love her so much. She's such a tragic. She gets reformed at the end, you know, and she dies. She dies. Spoiler alert.
It's mind blowing that you remember all these details, because I remember watching this with my family when I was like 8 years old, and I was so young. There's no way I could remember it, but to bring it into academic, speak, it's amazing. But who's actually qualified? Yeah. To say what is the correct learning? What teacher can we trust to say, you know, that guy, that woman is the perfect person to kind of guide us all through the right morality?
Yeah, that is such a good question. It's such a good question. There's no good answer to that question. And I think, you know, in this day and age, we have abandoned the hope of like finding a Quân Tử, like finding like a gentleman that will, you know, in Confucian terms, that we recognize as having this kind of moral sagacity to lead us. But I think in borrowing, like in the ancient time, that was the idea. Xingzi was like, go find yourself a real Quân Tử, you know. We don't live in that time anymore. But I think at the same time, we can learn the humility of what Xingzi was saying, which is like, you shouldn't just trust your own judgment. In fact, what you should do is you should challenge your own judgment all the time. Like what you should do is you should try to, if you haven't, I mean, it's encoded in the scientific process. Like what you do in science, you come up with a hypothesis, and what you immediately do when you have a hypothesis, you try to disprove it. You know, so like, I think one part of the answer is if I have a belief, if I have a passionate belief, what I should try to do when I look across the sea of information on the internet, or if I engage with AI, is I should try not to confirm or validate my belief. I should try to invalidate it. I should try to disprove it as a method of testing that belief. And of course, what we're all trained to do algorithmically with social media is the opposite. The social media algorithms give us things that will validate our ideas. And what we need to do is we need to do the exact opposite. If we now have such incredible power, like we can just access so much information now, then the responsible thing to do is the opposite of that self-validating intellectual process. The process is, now let me see if I'm wrong. Let me see what other ideas are out there that I couldn't even have imagined. You know, that's what you should do with the incredible power of modern knowledge information networks. But what we tend to do is see how all these other people agree with me, see how that guy is an idiot. Like, and that's the way to become increasingly stupid, despite the fact that you're increasingly literate. You know, like that's just a great irony, you know? And then the other thing is, I think we need to learn just intellectual cognitive skills, especially in this moment of AI, which AI is so powerful. And I'm very pro AI in a lot of ways, but it has crystallized that we need to work on particular human critical skills, like what we call critical thinking. What is an argument? What is evidence? You know, how do you logically piece together, you know, logic, really? I say it all the time in my classes. Learn logic. Learn the basic discipline of logic. Be able to spot fallacies. You know, and those skills also in the context of the modern era, like learn to spot AI style. You know, learn to spot an algorithmically produced piece of journalism, you know. Those are all critical skills that are super important in lieu of having a messiah who's going to just lead you through. You know, there's no one's going to be like that. We do have to learn those types of skills. And since you brought this up, Kenneth, I have to say that is what the humanities are. I hear a lot of different defenses of the humanities out there in the world. I don't think we've done a good job branding the humanities, but this is what the humanities are. And I think in the age of AI, it has made the humanities education absolutely priceless, absolutely important. And unfortunately, we're at the lowest point of valuing the humanities as an educational sort of system. So there has never been a time where the humanities have been more important. And everything we've been talking about is what constitutes what we call, generally speaking, the humanities.
It's crazy that you brought us here, because I was going to ask you, so this idea of Quân Tử, I roughly translates to nobleman in my mind.
Yeah.
Is that close enough for us right now in our conversation? Because I'm about to jump off a cliff.
Well, there's a very, very well established etymology to that, where it's a Quân Tử. You're right. Literally is noble man. Like Quân is a lord, like in the classical period. It's an aristocratic lord, and Tử is a child. So it's actually the son of a lord, which means a prince, basically a prince. But Confucius sort of used that word in a special way, because he used that word because he was teaching princes. He was teaching children of lords in the hope that they would grow up to not be sociopaths. So he was trying to make them, moral beings. But what his very famous reworking of that word is that to be a real Quân Tử, like you were all Quân Tử because you're born with the noble blood, but to be a real Quân Tử, to be a real child of a lord, a real noble person, as you put it, you have to have morals. You have to have an ethical value. So that is the true definition of a Quân Tử. So there's a superficial definition, which is a lord, but the real definition is a moral person. And the opposite of Quân Tử, is tiểu nhân, is a small person, a petty person. And tiểu nhân literally means small folk, like peasants in the classical time, like non-lords. But what he's saying is that the real definition of a small person is not a peasant. The real definition of a small person, a petty person, is one who does not have these morals. So he never said it outright, but his implication was quite revolutionary. He was saying, you can be the son of a lord, but you can be a petty person, right? And most of you are. Most of you are nobles, but you're not truly noble. So that's the etymology of that word.
I remember growing up, and my parents would always say, don't be petty, be Quân Tử, be heroic, be big, make sure your morals and your ethics are in place. As a Quân Tử, as a hero man, as a nobleman. It was such an interesting concept to kind of live that way.
Yeah, I am a little, well, my students don't, I probably am a little bit too pro-Confucian in general, but I think that's it's a nice thing that we don't have as much anymore, the concept of a moral person. Like I feel in some ways we're, maybe I'm being a little affected by my American identity at this point. It's intersecting with my Vietnamese identity, but I think we, especially in the West, but also in just the contemporary global atmosphere, we don't, in many places, not all places, but in many places, we don't, we're ashamed to talk about morality. Like we're afraid to value morals because we get in the quagmire of what is right and what is wrong. And we don't want to have that fight. But what could be more important than discussing what is right and what is wrong? Like what could be more important than figuring out what is moral and what is not moral? And I think, in some ways we miss the very idea that such a thing could exist and that we should be searching for it, even if we can never find it, even if there is no Quân Tử in the world. The idea that there could be a Quân Tử is a very valuable thing, I think. But going back to our conversation earlier, like Xingzi was saying, go find yourself a sage to teach you. And as to your point, you might not find one, but you can train yourself. You can train yourself to challenge yourself, and you can learn from other people according to what their expertise is. I mean, this is an old conversation that's in the current moment. Like, trust experts. Like, you're not a doctor. Listen to a doctor. And don't listen blindly. Like, use your intellect, but you don't have that training. So use your intellect, and then educate yourself. Listen to the opinions of experts. Learn from the knowledge of experts. I think we just we have such a distrust of intellectuals in America right now, and now I'm being very specifically about America, and I think it's self-destructive. That's what it is. Yeah,
I think we've lost this idea of Quân Tử, or we don't have it instituted so strongly in our modern culture. I think all over the world, because I think when I think about like Japanese culture, we think of the samurai as the Quân Tử. We think of them as whatever they kind of like put out into the world at the time was sort of this code. And then when you think about maybe like the American sort of like golden era of Quân Tử or respectability, you think of like the golden age of like the 1950s, or films that portrayed the hero of that time. And I think when I think about like the Vietnamese Quân Tử, I don't really have a reference for anybody in our maybe contemporary time in the last 100 years. I don't really know. Maybe when I think about Quân Tử, I think about Quans, which are the Quan of the king, right? The advisors to king. When I think about how I'm being told, hey, you know, this is sort of like the sort of the mark of honor, the level that you should be playing at and striving to become, is that's all I don't. It's very nebulous when I think about who my heroes, the Quân Tử of Vietnamese culture is.
Yeah, I think there's a disruption, and it involves what we talked about. Like culturally speaking, when we look at what forms modern Vietnamese culture, the colonial era you can't ignore it, and it informed so much of the main tropes of our cultural icons. So, you know, what is much more, I think, present in our minds as a cultural icon is not the Quân Tử per se, but maybe like Nhà Văn, like a literary, like, you know, the author, especially in some circles, like the Vietnamese writer, you know, who like is smoking a cigarette, is really thin, can see the ills of the society, you know, and is writing about them in a kind of passionate, kind of slightly depressive way. Like it's a clear, you know, like I think you don't have to reach very far. Hai Khung is like that person, you know, like there's a lot of
the image that you just described.
I mean, exactly. Chính Công Sơn is a musical version of that kind of Nhà Văn, you know? And that, of course, is very Vietnamese, but it's also a Vietnamese identity that emerged from French Romantic and Symbolist literature. So, you know, there's a very kind of French complexion to that part of our culture, and it's present in our minds. And you have to remember that in the colonial moment, when all the Vietnamese intellectuals were struggling with the idea that we just got conquered, you know, they were like, well, it's because there was something wrong with the Confucian system. So there was a kind of like a rejection of, a purging of, a throwing out of the bathwater with the baby, in my opinion, of a lot of, you know, what we now call traditional Vietnamese culture, and an embrace of what was at that point contemporary, new, modern. And, you know, now from the vantage point of the 20th and 21st, the late 20th and 21st centuries, that is now the traditional Vietnamese idea. And like the Nhà Văn is a traditional Vietnamese icon that replaced an older traditional Vietnamese icon, you know, of the Quân Tử. And I love that you pointed out the Quan, because that's exactly the replacement. If you read someone like Phan Bội Châu, you know, who is a great reformist in the early 20th century from the South, he was of the Mandarin, he was of the official Quan kind of family, like a literati family. And he was most critical of his own class, you know? So what our historical memory has now is a memory of officials failing the people. The Quan is not a good image. The Quan is like a conniving, you know, weak, corrupt
weasel.
You know? Yeah, weasel, exactly. And that's, you know, Phan Bội Châu was like, he was himself a Quan, but he was like, that's what we are. We're conniving, we're collaborating with the French, you know, we've failed. So, you know, of course, with that experience at the beginning of the 20th century, it's very hard to remember an earlier image of the Quân Tử. But you look back, look at someone like Nguyễn Trãi, look at someone, you know, like Phan Huy Ích. I mean, he's controversial, but I love him. Ngô Thị Nhậm. You know, these are Nguyễn Bình Khiêm, who actually lived in what he thought of as a corrupt moment. He quit the government, went into reclusion, these, there are so many figures like this who had deep political, moral things to say, and they left them in writing, but they're kind of not remembered very well in the mainstream because of more recent history.
Does this indicate, and I'm making a huge extrapolation here, does this indicate our lack of moral compass, our lack of heroes, our lack of, and I'm not saying that we don't have them. What I'm saying is that we don't know enough about them in the Vietnamese diaspora, in the Vietnamese population, 100 million people in Vietnam. Currently, what is taught? Is there any Quân Tử? Because I think if you look into, I don't know, maybe English literature, you look into English history, Britain, mainstream America, Japanese literature, you see these characters all over the place. Are we missing that?
Well, okay, I think two things. I think one, this is different in the diaspora than it is in Vietnam. I think it's one place where it's pretty clear. And I think the challenges are different in each part of the community. In Vietnam, there is good education on the main figures, nhân vật lịch sử, the kind of like figures of history. I mean, you can go to any bookstore in Vietnam and pick up like a children's book, and it'll be filled with a kind of cast of characters. It'll be Hai Bà Trưng, it'll be Nguyễn Trãi will be in there, Lê Lợi will be in there, Lê Thánh Tông probably will be in there. So there's a cast of characters that are baked into the public educational system. That's not the right word, but the educational system in Vietnam. But I think the challenge in Vietnam is that they are presented heavily editorialized by nationalist sentiment. And by nationalist sentiment, I mean specifically the government of Vietnam, like the communist vision of history and anti-colonial history and modern nationalist history. And that is a very heavy influence on the way in which these figures are presented and even who gets selected as represented. So there's a set of challenges there. Nevertheless, there is good education, I think. There's great education on the cast of figures that are heroic figures of Vietnamese history. In the diaspora, I think we are a diaspora, so you're not going to learn about Lê Lợi when you go to elementary school. Like it's part of what it means to be a diaspora community. And so I think there is a lower level of general education about these. But there's been some great people in our community who have created great children's books and created other resources to try to sort of disseminate Vietnamese culture. Some really good, even websites coming out of California that are also have done that. So I think there's been an effort to it. But I do agree, that we are also hampered by our own version of nationalism, deep nationalism, and it also hampers our selection and our understanding. Because, excuse me, very often what happens is the people who are trying to create these resources, their objective is cultural enrichment, and there needs to be more collaboration between those community leaders and the people who actually have the expert knowledge about those figures. So that there can be a beautiful collaboration between artists, community leaders, and scholars to create a new vocabulary, a new kind of set of resources about what we could call traditional Vietnamese culture, because there's a richness there that I think that is unexploited. And last note on this general issue, first of all, if anyone wants to collaborate, I have a couple friends who are community leaders who we've talked a little bit about doing things like this, and I think it's a great idea. So if anyone wants to, I am here for you. I would love to, be a resource for anyone who has a project like that. Second to last point on this point, if there's a platform that you can use, also, we have a new digital platform called Digitizing Vietnam. That's a Columbia project in collaboration. It's with Fulbright University Vietnam, but we service all parts of our community, including the diaspora. We have a bunch of diaspora stuff up on the site. And our whole point is to produce, we have many levels. We have a scholarly level that's really for highly refined research, but we have two other levels called basically pedagogy, teaching about Vietnam, and then an outreach level. And on that level, we want to create verifiable information and resources on Vietnamese culture exactly for this purpose, to share it, to contribute to the kind of revitalization and modern branding of Vietnamese culture that I think is going on right now. We talked about that last time.
Can we spend a whole episode on this? Because I didn't know that this is something you're involved with. And I think that by getting into the weeds in this topic, right, what you just talked about, I think it'll illuminate some of this trajectory of where we're going as a community of seekers and curious minds trying to figure out what the verifiable things are in the nooks and crannies in the work that we do.
I'd love to do that. Let's set up a conversation there. And let's also remind everyone who's still listening, good for you if you're still listening. You never know where this conversation is going to go.
Especially these AMAs.
Stay through the rest of the conversation. Don't just listen to the first.
I hope everybody who's listening is having such a good time the way I am, because this is what I come here for, right? It's just like we know our basic structure for this AMA, but I mean, at the same time, the beauty that comes out of, I think, these podcasts are these tangents that we find ourselves on.
I agree. And it, not to be too culturally crass about it, but I think it is also very Vietnamese. It's like, you sit down, cà phê cà pháo, have like a cà phê trứng, and you're sitting and you just don't know where that conversation's going to go. It's a kind of a sidewalk cafe, experience, which I think I really enjoy.
It's important because, I mean, how often are we going to be able to talk about Quân Tử as it relates to Tiểu Nhân, as Tiểu Nhân is related to Quan's? All of these things are so integral to kind of understanding the different layers of hierarchy in the Vietnamese world that really goes back, to sometimes when I think about being lost as a Vietnamese American diasporic kid, I take refuge in knowing that there are these things that are not discussed, that are seldom discussed in our circles, and to be able to talk about it here grounds me a lot.
Oh, that's so nice. Yeah, I think it's great. I love it. Yeah, but we have strayed a little bit from.
We have. Let's tackle one more question, and then we could probably tease out what I think is the next episode that we're going to discuss next.
Sounds good. Yeah. So there was I think I just want to say a word about the process of creating a national language and a national script, because I think a lot of the people who there was a set of comments that were about like, that really were engaging with the title of the episode. Is it the colonizer script? Like, is the Chinese script colonizing script? Is Nome itself a kind of colonized script? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, I really like the choice of our title last time because it puts its finger on a kind of a way that we tend to think about things like script and language in terms of nationalism. And it's another example of how we, even when we're not realizing it, we are thinking and interacting in the world informed by nationalist categories of identity. And I was pleased to see some people in the audience being like, what do you mean colonizer script? I mean, the alphabet was invented, is a derivative. The Roman alphabet is a derivative of an alphabet that's Phoenician, that's a derivative of Egyptian hieroglyphs. By the way, I don't know if you learned that from our podcast or not, but we did talk about that a couple podcasts ago. So, good for you for pointing that out. The alphabet itself, writing has only been invented 4 times. No one is not using a quote unquote colonizer script. Like everyone is using an alien script, essentially, because the ancient Chinese, the ancient Sumerians, the ancient Egyptians, and the ancient Mayans, none of them exist anymore. Like nowhere. Maybe you can make the greatest case for Maya people today, because that was pretty recent in history that they're closely related. But in all the other cases, those peoples are long, long gone, and their scripts and their languages have survived beyond those cultures. And like the 20th century was such a special moment because, especially in Asia, because Asia was like, oh shit, excuse me. Oh my God. Like we have to, Europe is so powerful and Europe organizes itself according to nation states. So we need to develop a narrative of nations, and nationhood. And that involves creating, having a national language and having a national script in which you write that language. But you got to remember that no East Asian culture organized itself or thought of itself in terms of what we now think of as the modern nation state. So, excuse me again. They had to create modern Chinese, modern Korean, modern Vietnamese. And it was a long process. For example, in China, they had a series of national assemblies to determine what the national language should be, and how it Cantonese lost by just a couple votes. I think we talked about that a couple episodes ago, etc. But, they had to select and then create a national language and then decide. And it was a political issue, not a cultural one. Like, it was a political issue, what that language should be, what it should sound like. And then there was the separate question of what should we write it in, So can I read something real quick? Do we have time for me to read something? I want to read two quick things because the language of the people was an idea that was new, and, I want to read something by Lu Xun, who is a modern Chinese reformist, and then something by Phan, who is a modern Vietnamese kind of guy. So Lu Xun was writing, he wrote about, because at that time, as in Vietnam, what he called, classical Chinese or literary Sinitic was the most prestigious form of writing for the intellectual elites, right? And he thought of that as the language of the Tang and Song dynasties, from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And Lu Xun writes, how can we who are not living in the Tang or Song dynasty write in the style of an age so far removed from our own? Even if the imitation is convincing, the voice is from the Tang or Song dynasty, the voice of Han Yu or Su Dongpo, not the voice of our generation. In other words, he's saying, he's trying to figure out what the national Chinese language should be. And he's like, it's got to be something closer to what we speak, And then Phan, who was running just actually a few years before Lu Xun published that article, wrote about something called establishing language, lap ngon in Sino-Vietnamese. He goes, what is establishing language? It is to convey the highest ideals of ourselves, our most caring sympathies, to convey all our feelings and our natures, crystallized into the spoken language of our country. That spoken language, which has already undergone countless generations to take form, and which will certainly be inherited by countless generations, never lost. In other words, when he's saying lap ngon, like, he means establishing a national language. And he's saying, what better language to be the national language than something close to what we speak? Because that's the language in which we feel all of our feelings. So I guess I'm saying a couple things. What I'm saying is, like, the world we live in now, when Vietnamese is the Vietnamese language and Chinese is the Chinese language as we learn them, Chinese is Mandarin, Vietnamese is this either Northern or Southern standard language, that took a long process to be created. And it was a process of a kind of modernization that involved, in fact, the lifting up of what was perceived to be the masses, and perceived to be the language of the masses. But there was no actual language of the masses. So they created a language that they called the national language. And then through generations of education, that became the national standard. And so when you encounter a podcast that's called, like, is this the colonizer's script? Or when you think about the language or script of a particular culture today, you got to remember that that's manufactured. And that there's no such thing as an essential Vietnamese language or essential Vietnamese script. This is the theme of all of the Viet Origins episodes, going all the way back to the beginning. So if you are one of those people who are like, no, Quốc Ngữ is not the colonizer script, you're right and you're wrong. You're wrong in the sense that, yes, it was invented by the French. But you're right because it's just a technology. And there is no essential Vietnamese language or script. Whatever Vietnamese people use or speak is Vietnamese. That's the end of the story. And it's an ever evolving, question. And it's not just Vietnamese people. The reason why I'm talking about Lu Xun is because the Chinese did the same thing. The Koreans did the same thing. A little earlier, the Japanese did the same thing. So rather than get embroiled in a fight about what is the real Vietnamese script or language or what is the colonizer script or language, it should be an invitation to learn about the process of the creation of modern national identities, which happened in the 20th century. So that's what I wanted to say about that.
John, thank you so much. I always enjoy this. Do you have the next topic that we can tease, or should people just tune in on the next episode?
You know what? Let me think about it. But given what you said earlier, I kind of feel like we should do a little chat about heroes or heroes of Vietnamese culture, or like icons, or the different kinds of who do we honor, or who do we valorize as expressions of greatness in Vietnamese culture.
I
think that'd be a nice. Yeah.
One time I was thinking about doing a series of Vietnamese heroes in terms of like the street signs and breaking that down. And I had these older, friends of mine say, no, you got to be careful. There's a lot of booby traps here if you try to pick that up, because street signs in Vietnam and the diaspora heroes are two different categories here. So be very careful as you. Yeah, but I think we should get into that. I think it's a worthy topic.
Let's try it. Let's do it. Yeah.
All right, John. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kenneth. Great to see you.
Good to see you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. Special thanks to Brittany Tran, to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast.